Welcome once again to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. I shall be winding this module with 2 lectures devoted to the key concept gender. Gender, as you know, is a concept which is not new. It is a concept we find in disciplines ranging from, or in disciplines as diverse as literature, anthropology, even biology and sociology and the like. The term gender has sort of migrated throughout so many decades, and it is a dynamic concept, often misunderstood. It has its histories, it has taken different contours in the history of its development, in its genealogy as a critical term. Before moving on to gender, as always, we shall be doing a recap of the last lecture. Well, our last lecture was on the key concept discourse, and I will bring in just a few slides from the previous lectures. And as we see here, we talked about discourse through the words of Chris Barker, and we saw that first, discourse is seen in a simple way, in an elementary way, as a stretch of text. Okay? We talked about the fact that discourse comes ultimately from a combination of words. Words are strung together by the letters of the alphabet in different languages. Letters give rise to words. Words are strung together to form sentences, and sentences form together to make a paragraph. And then we have a discourse which has certain which has a certain unity about it, right? Or spoken utterances. Discourse can also be seen as spoken utterances that cohere, this is important, that cohere into a meaningful exposition. There has to be some unity of, a unity of theme, some unity of, the way of speaking, or also the way of writing, if something has to be a discourse. Very discrete, unrelated sentences do not make up a discourse, as you are well aware of. Next, Barker says, however, cultural studies practitioners are more often than not using the concept of discourse in a more technical way. Here, discourse is said to unite language and practice. So, we know that when we come to cultural studies, discourse is more than a simple, so to speak, innocent utterance, or even a written stretch of text. Okay, here language and practice are entwined into this is the most important thing here, regulated ways of speaking about anything. Okay, they are regulated, there are laid out rules about how you can speak about something. That is how you can build a discourse. These are not random collections of sentences. Then we also had occasion to look at David Hart and how he says that discourse has a wide scope, wide applicability. It is non-positivist, that is, it is not something that is, that is something, quantifiable, that it is not something that is measurable. Okay, it is non-positivist, and we've talked about positivism and non-positivism. We have alluded to them in previous lectures, and discourse gives rise to new approaches in every field. Next, we also saw that the subject, okay, this is important, the subject is seen by many as the effect of discourse. That is, a subject, say me or you, I or you. Our subjectivities are, remember we talked about subjectivity as, at least as opposed to identity, as a sort of an inner life, okay, or an inner understanding of oneself. Subjectivity is seen when related to discourse as an effect of discourse, that is, as an effect of language, as an effect of a regulated way of speaking. So that when you speak of man as a subject, or if you speak of person S as a subject, the inner life or what it feels to be that particular person or that particular entity is something that ultimately is attributed to language through discourse, okay, is ultimately seen as the word we have here is seen as the effect, okay, the effect of discourse. Now, the certain related terms, we also saw that there are certain related words, terminology in the discourse of discourse, as it were, and these we found are ones like discursive practice, we have talked about that in the last lecture, episteme, which is a knowledge unit. If you remember, episteme is a knowledge unit, and according to some critics and cultural analysts like Michel Foucault, every epoch is governed by a certain episteme. Then we had discursive formations, which allude to the formations of, say, the subject, for instance, okay, through different practices, right, and also allude to the formations of discourse that sort of coalesce or coagulate into certain formations that are sought to be seen as things that are established and almost things that are natural. Then finally, we also looked at the word regimes of truth. Discourses, finally, at least they discourses are seen to be aiming to be regimes of truth, and look at the military metaphor here. Okay, discourses are regimes of truth. These are truths that rule us, so to speak, in different epochs, in their different discursive formulations. We also looked at the death of the author as expounded by Michel Foucault, and we saw that the death of the author doesn't mean literally that the author doesn't exist. It simply means that the very concept of individuality of of a person, of an author, is problematized here, because we have to understand that whatever the author tells us is mediated through a language, is mediated through a discourse, which are, as we know, regulated ways of speaking. So, the complete agency, okay, of an author or a writer or anyone who is speaking is undermined in this discourse, right. So, these are some of the ways in which discourse has been articulated and defined and described or even labeled by some critics, and discourses are cognitive schemata. They are not just in language, they are in fact in our cognitive systems. They embed themselves in our cognitive systems through repeated use, okay, through reiteration, and they become part of our ways of thinking. On the other hand, discourses are also instrumental devices. Discourses are used, so to speak, by those in power to instrumentalize our lives. They also give rise to a feeling of ontological realism, as if there is something essential in that discourse, which also tries to probably essentialize, as it tries to pin us down to certain descriptions and definitions and ways of speaking. Discourse is also seen as being so important, so powerful, as having causal powers, okay, in our cultural practices. and in our subjectivities as well. Discourses are hence also looked at as objects, as structured systems, as ideological systems, and of course, any text is a discourse because it is a regulated way. I mean, how many different ways can you talk, in how many very unrelated or even illogical ways can you talk about something within a certain discourse. Okay? A text is therefore a regulated way of speaking. Fine. So, I hope this brief recap has been useful to us, and if you may go back to our discussion on discourse and look at it in a more detailed way. Well, now we come to the topic for the topic of our discussion today. This lecture is part 1 of gender. As I had mentioned, I shall be devoting 2 lectures to the topic of gender. As I had mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, gender is increasingly being problematized through different domains of knowledge, and it is not just to do, the most important thing is not just to do with women. Whenever we use the word gender, many of us think that it refers only to women, and that is why in my lecture today, instead of talking of femininities, I shall be dwelling for a brief while on the study of masculinities, and just a couple of formulations made by a few critics on masculinities. So, it is important for us to understand that gender does not mean simply women, it does not refer to only to women's rights. Gender is something much more than that, as we shall see. Now, as has been the practice in this series of video lectures on cultural studies, we shall be looking at the key concept gender through a few established critics in the domain. Okay. This, as I have mentioned earlier, this exercise or this way or methodology adopted in these lectures is because in the humanities you cannot really, it is not a very good method to simply summarize or describe, okay, what things mean, to describe the various contours, to describe the various ways in which articulations have been done on different topics. Okay. So, it is, I believe, desirable to bring in the formulations on any area, in particularly in cultural studies, as given to us by some established writers in the field. So, a few of the books I would like to mention here. These are key source texts in this lecture, and you are acquainted with Danny Cavallaro's Critical and Cultural Theory. Of course, Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice is really the key. If I have to identify a key text in this series of lectures, video lectures, it would be Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice. I will also briefly refer to an essay by R.W. Connell entitled Masculinities and Globalization when I talk about masculinities in this lecture on gender. Fine. So, there are 3 terms that come immediately to our mind when we are talking about gender, and at least in a bid to as a first step, okay, to try and delimit each of these terms, each of these areas. So, these definitions we are now taking from Cavallaro's Critical and Cultural Theory. First, when we talk about sex as a concept, as a theoretical tool or even as a key concept, Cavallaro says that sex traditionally referred to the difference between males and females with regard to their reproductive functions, and by extension to activity leading to reproduction. Okay? So, you will recognize here, let us look at this again. Traditionally, whenever people formulated or made formulations or theorized on sex, they would say that the sex is nothing but the biological. Okay? The biological sex referred to the biological differences between males and females with regard to particularly their reproductive functions and by extension to activity leading to reproduction. Now, remember, this is, we are not saying that this is the definition of sex, and you remember, look at this word traditionally. Okay? Cavallaro says that traditionally sex refers to simply to biological differences between males and females. The second term with us is that of gender, which is the topic of this discussion. The necessity, now I am quoting from Cavallaro, the necessity of surpassing reductionist accounts of femininity and masculinity as coterminous with an individual's biological sex, and of, this is important, of stressing their socio-political determination. Okay? So, this is, we began to talk about gender in some part of the history of gender studies, as in a first bid to differentiate between sex and gender. We began to say that instead of a reduction, instead of reducing or taking a reductionist stance and talking about gender only in terms of biological differences, we saw that instead of femininity and masculinity as being coterminous or being continuous with one's with an individual's biological sex, okay, the body, it was necessary to sort of delink it and to talk about gender and pushing gender into the domain of the socio-political. So that we began to say that sex is biological, gender is a social construct. Now, there are definitely, as many of you know, problems with this sort of articulation, and I would be hinting at this problematics in this lecture, but we would take this up in the next lecture, that is part 2 of the video lecture on gender, when we begin to talk about gender through a key a contemporary figure, that is Professor Judith Butler and her works in the main. So, let us read this again. Gender is the necessity of surpassing reductionist accounts of femininity and masculinity as coterminous with an individual's biological sex and of stressing their socio-political determination. Finally, there is another word that comes in this discourse, which is the term sexuality. Now, sexuality is not sex, it is not gender. Sexuality is defined here by Danny Cavallaro as a person's sexual proclivities and the practices in which he accordingly engages. Okay? Now, sexuality here as a first definition would mean our our sexual orientation. For instance, is our orientation to a same sex one, towards homosexuality, or is it towards heterosexuality, or is it towards different different kinds, different combinations of sexualities, which would, as it is said here by Cavallaro, which would sort of lead to or determine the practices in which one accordingly engages, sexual socio-sexual practices in which we would accordingly engage ourselves with. So, these are the 3 terms: sex, gender and sexuality. We need to deal with as we enter the domain or discourse of gender in cultural studies. So, look at it as a diagram here. Sex was thought to be simply biological, referring to reproductive functions and to our reproductive activities. Gender, when we sociologists first, I guess, sociologists and theorists began to talk about gender, they sought to go beyond reductionist approaches by delinking the biological and the social, and to argue for socio-political determinants of gender. Sexuality is seen as a person's sexual proclivities, and by extension the practices in which the person accordingly engages, that is given one's sexual orientation in the main. Now, what I am going to do next is I am within this sort of how should I put it, within this older school, okay, of looking at sex and gender, there are certain articulations, and some of this I bring from my book on book entitled Gender, Culture and Writing. Anthropologist Margaret Mead, Margaret Mead is a very important figure in early anthropology, and Mead realized, let us look at this, Mead realized that the differences between the sexes is one built on the important conditions upon which mankind has built the many varieties of human culture that give human beings dignity and stature. You will quickly realize, okay, that Mead is saying that as the foundation of many varieties of human culture, right, lies the difference between the two sexes, male and female. This, she says, is the important conditions upon which mankind has built varieties of human culture. So, here sex is seen, one's biological sex, sexual differences are seen to be, so to speak, the foundation on which even human cultural variety rests on. Further, gender as a term is usually distinguished from the term sex. This is what we had seen before. While sex is biological identity, gender is a social construct. The next person we are going to talk about is somebody who is very well known, Simone de Beauvoir, who as many of you are aware, was one of the most important French philosophers of her time, and Simone de Beauvoir was creating the genesis of this view of gender in her famous statement, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Now, this literally, if you look at it, it seems like, well, how is a girl, how is a baby not born as a woman? Okay, what she is trying to bring to us here is when she says one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, is a process of socialization through which the category woman, the practice woman, the experience of being woman is constructed. Okay. So, this is really the definition by way of gender, right. In the other instance from Margaret Mead, what did we see? We saw that she says that even the biological fact of being male or female and the differences between sexual differences between or the difference between the sexes is an important condition of human culture. In the case of Simone de Beauvoir, right, in the case of Simone de Beauvoir, she says one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Okay. So, this is here ontology, okay, one is born and rather becomes a woman is a process, right. So, one is never ontologically a woman. Now, the category woman, the term woman here meaning not just female, we have then to distinguish between female, being female, born female in a biological sense, and being woman. It is civilization, look at this here, it is civilization as a whole that produces this creature. Okay, that is civilization, the civilizing processes, the cultural social processes that go into the making of, as we said, the definition, the identity and the practices of being woman. Next, feminist critics have rightly argued for a discourse based on gender politics. For most of them, the humanist view of literature and culture is highly contestable. They would say, what do you mean by humanist? Okay? Humanist is nothing but the male way or the masculinist way or other the patriarchal way of building discourses, of building practices and identities. So, for most of them, for instance, like Luce Irigaray, the French feminist, many of them assert that not to accept gender difference is to indulge in unbridled idealism. Okay? So, the reality is gender difference, something that we have to talk about, to further problematize in a bit to understand the complexities of gender. Next, neutral, liberal and humanist approaches are nihilistic according to these critics, and women who adopt such approaches face the danger of being defeated and swallowed by a new humanism. So, they caution us. They say that when you say that knowledge should be neutral, understanding should be liberal, should be human based and not should be based on a category called human, which they say many say is a neutral liberal category. So, they said we are just fooling ourselves, okay, because it is a term that is a nihilistic term, and women and of course men who adopt such approaches, that we are find many important writers immediately saying giving disclaimers like, I am not a feminist. Okay. So, I am a humanist, I write from a human perspective. So, they contest this whole term known called human. Okay. What is human is nothing but patriarchy or male centered discourses, okay, that is disguised under the humanist approach, and therefore, there is danger, as they say, of being swallowed up by a new humanism that is nothing but male centered discourses, male centered thinking and practices disguised under the label the new humanism. So, these are some of the ways in which feminist critics, literary critics have expounded on or have talked about the terms sex and gender. Now, there is another poet and critic, Adrienne Rich. Those of you who are from literary studies would recognize, would know about Adrienne Rich. Now, let us read. For the feminist poet and critic Adrienne Rich, the humanity trip is too easy. She calls it the humanity trip. Okay, is too easy and comfortable, and is a serious impediment to women in their quest for full equality. Nor is the humanist approach suspect only to feminist critics. For any critic arguing from an ideological or political standpoint, humanism is guilty of harboring a gender blind spot. Okay. So, Adrienne Rich cautions us therefore that it is if you are on the humanity trip, you are really innocent of so many cultural and political shades of areas such or domains such as gender and even of sex and sexuality. She calls it harboring, it's like harboring a gender blind spot. Well, so therefore, in the old schema, we see sex as the fundamental axis of social organization, which leads to the subordination of women to men. Okay, and as long as we stay within the essentialist notion of sex, as we saw even in Margaret Mead's words, that sex is the fundamental axis of social organization. These are of course all problematized. We will be looking at this later on in the next. So, I thought it was important to bring in the historical development of and the different shades the term gender takes on. Sex is also of course power relations. If you look at the sexual body, okay, and sexual relationships, these are of course saturated with power relations. Then Kate Millett in her, this is an early book in the 1960s, and Sexual Politics, she describes patriarchy. And what is patriarchy? Patriarchy comes from the word pater, meaning father. Patriarch and archy meaning rule. So, as a first definition, we say patriarchy is the rule of the father. So, she describes patriarchy as a political institution. Okay? Patriarchy is not simply an arrangement where the father rules in the family and men rule in society. It is also to be seen as a political institution. Why? Because it is so saturated with power. For Millett, the term politics refers to, this is the word, power structured relationships. Okay? Politics is, as we saw in some of the earlier lectures also, politics is not just to do with government, it is not just to do with the vote. Okay? Politics permeates our everyday lives. Politics permeates our everyday experiences, and in this case, there, in the case of sex, gender and sexuality, we cannot divide the social, the sexual, the gendered from politics. So, for Millett here, the term politics refers to power structured relationships, systems and arrangements by which one group of persons controls another. So, in this case, particularly in reference to gender, then we may say gender politics refers to the domination of one gender by another. Within a patriarchal discourse, you would say that it refers to the political everyday dominance, power saturated relationships in which women are dominated by men. In the discourse of homosexuality, we would say then it refers to the political, everyday, cultural, social, sexual domination through discourse of homosexuals by heterosexuals. Okay? So, we have to understand that we have to move away from the simple sex, gender studies referring to simply the domination of women by men. We have to stretch it, okay, to different, even to sexuality, sexual proclivities, orientations and their practices. So, therefore, we move again, let us look at how Danny Cavallaro has articulated this. So, we now return to Danny Cavallaro's text, and we shall look at how he has articulated some of the points here. Now, let us look at this slide. Cavallaro says social identities are not centered on fixed properties acquired at birth and bound to remain stable thereafter. Okay? So, these are the same things that we have discussed, but I would like to bring to you the way in which Cavallaro has articulated it. Let us look at this again. Social identities are not centered on fixed properties acquired at birth and bound to remain stable thereafter. They result, that is social identities, they result from multiple and shifting roles. Okay? We have to look at ourselves as our social identities. Some of the things which are mentioned earlier in a couple of lectures, that they are always multiple, they are shifting and they are dynamic. Okay? So, our social identities result from multiple and shifting roles which people, please look at the slide here, which people are required to play in both private and public contexts on the basis of their genders and sexualities. So, there is a certain fluidity now that is coming in, okay, compared to the earlier discourse, particularly in this paragraph, where Cavallaro says that we know by now that our identities are not fixed. Certainly, they are not fixed at certain properties that are acquired by us at birth, and they are of course never stable. we have to understand that these identities are multiple, and it is very important for us to stop here, to pause here and to look what we mean by multiple and shifting roles. Okay? It immediately argues for non-essentialism. It immediately argues for a non-ontological view of ourselves, whether as gendered beings or not, or from whichever discourse. Okay? One of the key formulations in cultural studies, which I had alluded to in my first lecture in these series of lectures on cultural studies, is that we are required, we are required to play several roles in our lives. For instance, the very typical understanding of women as nurturers of children in the family, and men as providers in the family, the father as a provider and the mother as a nurturer. Okay? However, you may want, or some may want to look at these roles as fixed, as stable, which of course goes back to the discourse of essentialism, of one being born as male or female, as Cavallaro says, properties acquired during birth. Okay? One needs to remember that these are not fixed. Even if you look at your own families, no matter what kind, what degree of orthodox practices you may have seen in your families, it is not quite the case that the man is always the provider and the woman is always the nurturer. Let us see how many times we have been nurtured by our fathers, for instance. Forget about stay-at-home fathers today, but even in our time, how many times we have been nurtured, so to speak, by our fathers, and how many times our mothers have been providers in the family. Okay? So, it is necessary for us to break these binaries, as Cavallaro would argue, and to accept the fact, to recognize the fact that we play multiple and shifting roles. Now, let us look at this again. They result from multiple and shifting roles which people are required to play in both private and public contexts on the basis of their genders and sexualities. Okay? So, not just in rearing children, for instance, even on the basis of our genders and sexualities, we play multiple shifting dynamic roles. Next, normalizing strategies are largely a result of the heavy legacy of sexual morality. Now, why do we have this, this word normalizing strategies? Okay, there's always you will find that instead of the rule seems to be, the practice seems to be that social practices are there is an attempt to normalize. Right, normalize, and we should refer to the works of Michel Foucault in this case. We will not be bringing this here, but suffice it for the moment to simply articulate this fact that normalizing strategies are largely a result of the heavy legacy of sexual morality, okay, in ethical philosophy. Now, there is always desire, there is always some would say even a need to normalize our sexual and sexual lives, our gendered lives, not to have too much of multiplicity, and even if there are these shifting roles that we play, to sort of not really highlight these. So, through Cavallaro's text or his essay on gender and sexuality, we have already entered a domain which is slightly different from, as I had said, the older school of looking at gender, the older school of looking at gender only as gender issues as only being women's issues. Then I would come to Barker in his book Cultural Studies, where he says that gender, the study of gender, as we have seen before, okay, it has a huge scope and applicability. Okay, it goes through so many, there's so many domains that it touches. For instance, sociology, anthropology, literature, even science, biology. Okay, but he says that when we talk about gender within the rubric of cultural studies, we have to zoom in, so to speak, on on the commonalities, okay, between gender studies and cultural studies. That is, how does gender as a concept fit into the cultural studies discourse. So, let us read from Barker. Barker says, it is impossible to conceive of a cultural studies that did not do so. That is, it is not possible for us to think that it is not possible for us to think that gender has nothing to do with cultural studies. While feminist thinking permeates cultural studies, not all forms of feminism are to be thought of as cultural studies. This is important, okay? Nor are all zones of cultural studies concerned with questions of gender. Here is Barker telling us that we need to sort of delimit the ways, we need to tell ourselves of the delimitations of the study of gender within cultural studies. And how does this happen? Fine. He says that as long as gender, okay, the study of gender, the exploration of gender and the critiquing of our gendered lives is filtered or done through, through topics like these or through concepts like these. For instance, if that is to say, if they are studied along with these, only then does the study of gender, okay, and as in his case it says feminism, fit into the study, fit into the rubric of cultural studies. What are these terms? Let us look at this slide. If we have to study gender within cultural studies, then we look at gender in terms or in relation to one, power. We talk about the representation of gender, whether of masculinities or femininities, it is important, or homosexualities or heterosexualities, or of drag, for instance. Okay? It is important for us to also see these in terms of representation through the theories and articulations of representation. We also need to see the manifestations of gender. We need to explore the manifestation of gender in popular culture. Okay? We also need to look at how subjectivity is, so to speak, related to gender, to our gendered experiences. How are our gendered experiences and our subjectivities related? Okay, and we have already talked about power, representation, subjectivity, identities. How are our identities tied to our gendered identities? Okay, and consumption. What are our consumption needs? What are our consumption patterns? What are our consumption desires as filtered through gender, that is, as filtered through our experiences as gendered people in a culture. Okay? So, these are the terms: power, representation, subjectivity, identity, popular culture and consumption. These are a few terms. There are of course many that you could bring in. For instance, you could bring in articulation. Obviously, you can bring in ideology. Okay, so these are just a few terms that we see that. So when you talk about gender within a cultural studies framework, you have to sort of at least begin to filter the study of gender, the talking about gender through these terms. Then quickly refer to off center. Okay, since we are talking about the relation between feminism and cultural studies, as also referred to by Barker, Franklin and others talk about this in their book Off Center. I will quickly read this out. The aspirations of feminism and cultural studies to connect with social and political movements outside of the academy. Okay, these are certain commonalities that we will talk about here on this slide. A critical stance vis-a-vis more established disciplines such as sociology and English literature has to be more than what is done in these domains, and the more critical, critical stance and almost an oppositional stance. Next, number 3, a mutual suspicion of and challenge to established ideas of certain knowledge and the wish to produce knowledges of and by marginalized and oppressed groups within the avowed intention of making a political intervention. Now, this is something we have talked about so many times. In fact, beginning from the first lecture, we have talked about the need for extra critiquing, the need of being, of developing, of honing our critical skills, and to need to think outside of academia, outside the academy, to engage in political movements, in social movements, and to deliberately start producing knowledges, by marginalized groups. In our case, would be by the marginalized groups would be whoever is from a gender perspective marginalized, that is to speak, whose experiences are seen as inferior, whose experiences are not given proper voice or proper representation, whose identity is seen to be suspect, whose subjectivities are not considered. So, these are some of the commonalities of feminism and cultural studies. For instance, how now Barker had said that we have to look at gender and gender through subjectivity. So, not all aspects of gender are taken up in cultural studies. For instance, let us take an example. How do we do this? Now, let us look at one of the relations, that between gender and subjectivity, and we see, for instance, how certain how our subjectivities, can or are constructed by certain discourses. Here the discourses of sexuality, for instance, in medicine, in the medical sciences, how sexuality has been constructed by those who have written about the experiences of women, who have written about the embodied experiences of women. And one of the clear and by now most cited examples, one of, you may even say, the most glaring examples is that of hysteria, particularly in the 19th century, when hysteria was seen as a particularly female affliction, as a particularly nervous disorder in the female, which is directly related to their sexualities. So, and which went on to so to speak, construct their subjectivities, their understandings of themselves. So, quickly, as I said, we will end up by looking at Cornell's Masculinities and Globalization, and I quote from him: masculinities do not first exist and then come into contact with femininities, they are produced together. So, it is important for us, we have been looking so much at femininities, I would like to talk about masculinities in this lecture, and accordingly we should understand that masculinities on a world scale, we must first have a concept of the globalization of gender. And then he goes on to say that there is today a world gender order, which has come to us through gendered institutions, gender regimes of institutions, and gender orders of local society. And this gender on a large scale is one that has been created and rests with and is given to us through the state, through international relations, through international trade, and through global markets. These have historical roots. These are the result of three phases, as Cornell says. The colonial conquest, they were gender segregated forces. In colonial stabilization phase, there were these new gender divisions of labor, and even in the decolonization and world market phase, there is a restructuring of gender divisions of labor in the global factory, which also gives rise to masculine subjectivities, masculine identities, and masculinities. So, it is not just we look at feminism or female subjectivities as being so quote unquote victims of the world order. So, the discourse of masculinity, according to Chris Barker, tries to pin down men in the discourse of reason, distance, control, and independence, and you can refer to the chapter by Barker in cultural studies, where he says that these ultimately lead to masculine subjectivities characterized by lack of emotional communication, self-destruction, a propensity to self-destruction, addiction, and violence. So, these are also subjectivities, as you see, definitely worthy of study within gender studies. So, let us come to the discussion, and I will just we'll talk about a few of the things we discussed through questions. Now, if you have a question, get a question like this: how have sex, gender and sexuality been differentiated in theory? We see that sex has been traditionally looked as something biological to do with our reproductive functions and our reproductive activities. Gender is seen to be beyond reductionist approaches, and we delink the biological, that is sex, from the social, that is gender, and argue for the socio-political determinants of our gender experiences. Sexuality is seen as a person's sexual proclivities and orientations, finally, which give rise to their sex behaviors, or their sexual behaviors. So, what are the concepts and issues common to gender studies and cultural studies as given by Chris Barker? These are the common issues, or at least when we study gender in cultural studies, we have to understand that we need to look at these through, or filter these through, the established concepts in cultural studies, which are power, representation, popular culture, subjectivity, identities, and many more, like ideology, for instance. Now, what are the salient terms in the discourse of masculinity? The salient terms in the discourse of masculinity, in the dominant discourses of masculinity, are reason, distance, control and independence. Now, these are salient terms that finally lead to the masculine subjectivities, which are those of a propensity to violence, a propensity to self-destruction, addiction and violence. Now, this is not to say that this is all that masculine subjectivities and behavior is, but you know, a discourse that highlights things like reason, distance, control and independence as being, you know, the desired masculine characteristics, according to Chris Barker, have been responsible in giving rise to certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of orientations, proclivities in men, like lack of emotional communication, addiction, etc. So, this is the first part of our discussion on gender, and we have looked at more or less the traditional way of differentiating between sex and gender. We have also looked at sexuality. We have looked at, if talked about you know, the way in which gender studies or gender studies is supposed to be done within the cultural studies framework. We've seen how masculinity is historically the result of a world gender order, which has been there since colonial times in its different forms, in its different so to speak, attempts at fixing meanings and identities in different epochs of history. In the next lecture, we are going to problematize some of the things that we have stated here, particularly through the works of Professor Judith Butler. So, for now, thank you and goodbye.